Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us tonight. So the Missouri Bumble Bee Atlas is a project that launched last August. So it's relatively new to the state. And it's a collaboration between the Missouri Department of Conservation, Pheasants and Quail Forever, University of Missouri's College of Agriculture, Food and Natural Resources, as well as the Xerces Society. So we have quite a few panelists representing each organization or agency here with us. And so we're going to start with an introduction from each person. My name is Katie Lamke, and I'm a conservation biologist for the Xerces Society. My main role is to coordinate the Missouri Bumble Bee Atlas as well as the Nebraska Bumble Bee Atlas. So if you have any questions throughout this project, you will most likely be reaching out to me. And Rich, you want to go next?
Sure thing. Hi, everybody. My name is Rich Hatfield. I'm a senior conservation biologist for the Xerces Society and direct our Bumblebee Conservation programs. I'm here mostly in a support role, but I'm helping to coordinate atlases in 6 states throughout the US, mostly in the West. We have atlas projects in Oregon, Washington, Idaho, Nebraska, and Missouri. So very excited that you're all joining us this evening. And I'll be back later this evening to talk a little bit about the threats and conservation issues surrounding bumblebees, but thank you for being here.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Bill White with the Missouri Department of Conservation, and I serve as the Community and Private Land Conservation Chief for the department. And I just want to say I'm very appreciative of this partnership. We wouldn't be able to do this without all of the partners involved. If one of them dropped off, we probably wouldn't be able to pull this off. So thanks to all the partners for your help in getting this going.
Hi, I am Debbie Finke, and I am an insect ecologist with the University of Missouri in the College of Agriculture, Food and Natural Resources. I'm happy to help in any way.
Hi, everybody. I'm Jake Swafford. I'm a coordinating wildlife biologist with Quail Forever and Pheasants Forever here in Missouri. I work on pollinator and monarch-specific programs in Northwest Missouri, helping private landowners with conservation efforts on their properties. So yeah, really excited to be here. I see so many interested folks and happy to be a part of this partnership.
Okay, thank you. Let me get the slideshow going here again. So this is a 2-part training series, which most of you have probably seen that. Tonight, we're going to look at Bumble Bee ecology, conservation, some of the threats they're facing, and go into just a small intro to the Atlas, what the project is, what we're hoping to accomplish. And then on Thursday night at the same time, we are going to be looking at the nitty-gritty of how to participate in the Atlas. So how you conduct surveys, how to take photos of bumblebees, how to submit your data, everything that you need to know to participate in the Atlas. And let's start with the Xerces Society. A lot of people are either unfamiliar with the name or don't know how to pronounce it. It starts with an X. It's a little bit intimidating, but it is pronounced the Xerces Society. And we get our name from the first butterfly known to go extinct from human causes. So our organization works to protect invertebrates as well as the habitat that supports them. And we work with invertebrates because they really are the foundation of what keeps us all functioning on this earth, right? They're helping with decomposition, they help with biocontrol, they're the base of the food chain, they help to filter water, and particular to today's topic, they help with pollination services. And so Xerces has about 50 different people on staff that are in 18 different states working to protect invertebrates through conservation, advocacy, research, and education, right? We hold a whole bunch of workshops like this one. We put out books and field guides to create more pollinator-friendly habitat. We're working directly with land managers to create that habitat. We are working with people in the policy world to create better pollinator habitat for cities or towns, or maybe pesticide-free areas. So we have our hands in a lot of different places. And the best thing about Xerces is that it is a donor-supported nonprofit. So we are a 501c3 that has about 12,000 members. We work with many different scientists, and if you would like to become a member and stay up to date with invertebrate conservation and see everything that we're doing, you can log on to xerces.org/donate. And before we dive in deep to bumblebees, we're going to take a broad look at pollinators and sort of understand their value. And a lot of us, we know about pollination, but it's not something that we've had to think about maybe since elementary school, right? So pollination is when the pollen grains are picked up from one flower and delivered over to the female part of another flower. And this is how the plant reproduces. And that's when we see things like nuts and seeds and fruits and berries, all the delicious things that we like to eat. And with that, this pollination service keeps the diversity of plant communities, right? It allows the plants to flourish and grow. And these plants are helping with nutrient cycling, soil stability, water filtration, carbon sequestration. And if you look at some of these prairie plants here on this slide, you can see that some of them, like compass plant, for example, its roots can go down about 15 feet in the soil. Pretty impressive plants. And the plants themselves are providing food for many other different types of wildlife that live in our natural areas. So our small mammals, many different species of songbirds, up to your larger predators, right? So these pollinators are really helping ensure that that food web keeps cycling. And then when we look at how pollination services affect our own choices, right? They have a lot of effect on our diet. Many of our choices and essential vitamins and minerals come from pollination services. And a few years back, Xerces had the opportunity to partner with Whole Foods and remove everything in the produce section that was pollinated by an insect. And when that happened, it looked a little bit something like this. So we don't necessarily lose everything, but you can see that we lose a lot of that color in our diet, a lot of the choices that we like, and a lot of those vitamins and minerals. And this is only the produce section, right? So that's not thinking about things like nuts or coffee or chocolate that also require pollination. And so when you think about the impact that a pollinator has in maintaining natural areas and helping the food web stay cycle and providing us with so much in our diet, we call them keystone species, because a keystone species is an organism that has a proportionately large value compared to its environment. So if you think about removing pollinators from the environment, it would look drastically different. And it's been said that more than 85% of flowering plants on Earth require pollination, and that's usually carried out by an insect. So when we look at the main groups of insect pollinators, that includes butterflies, flies, moths, wasps, beetles, but the most effective one is the bee. And the reason for this is a few different things. So the first one is that bees are the only insect to consume both nectar and pollen as adults and larvae. So throughout their whole life, they are continuously relying on flowers for their source of food. And because of that, bees have evolved these really functional characteristics on their hind legs that allow them to collect and transport a lot of different pollen. So on their hind leg here, you can see that this bee has really, really dense hairs that sort of function as a brush. We call them scopy. And these hairs are just able to be packed full of pollen. So the bee can fly around to different flowers, collect her pollen, and then fly back to her nest with a large load. It's sort of like carrying in all the groceries on one trip. Some other bees, instead of having scopy, will have a corbicula or a pollen basket, which is what bumblebees have. So this image right here is a bumblebee. And if we zoom in on that hind leg, you can see she has a grooved out section. And it functions as a basket. So the bumblebee is able to pack that full with pollen and fly back to her nest with a large load of food. So here you can see in this photo, the bumblebee has a huge pollen basket. I'm not sure how much more pollen she can place there. And the last thing that makes bees most effective pollinator is that they exhibit flower constancy. And flower constancy is a behavior that sort of ensures cross-pollination is carried out. So as a bee is leaving her nest and she's presented with maybe some coneflowers, some compass plant, some roses, she's going to fly from coneflower to coneflower to coneflower and deliver the appropriate pollen to that flower, right? Because if the bee was flying to coneflower and then to a rose, those plants aren't going to reproduce because they can't use that pollen. So the flowers and the bees have figured out this mutual relationship here where they both benefit. But when most of us think of a bee, a lot of us think of honeybees, right? It's an object of familiarity for us. They are a huge staple in our agricultural system, but they're not the bees that are native to the US, and they're not the bees that we're going to see flying around most times in our natural areas. So we're going to take a poll here just to see how many of you know how many different species of wild native bees are found in the US. So just take a second here and click which answer you think. How many different species of wild native bees are found in the United States? Looks like we've got a pretty well-informed crowd here. Answers are still coming in. We'll give you a few more seconds. Okay, looks like Mo's still coming in. All right. So the majority of you barely guessed the right answer here. So I'll share the results. So there are about 3,600 different species of wild bees in the US. And when we look at the diversity of wild bees, it is immense, right? They come in different sizes, different colors, they have different social behaviors, different foraging behaviors. They nest differently. Some are above ground, some are below ground. Some of them build their own nest, some of them rent a nest. But worldwide, there's about 20,000 different kinds of bees that we know about, and there's still a lot waiting to be discovered. In Missouri, it's been estimated that there's about 450 species, but again, that's just our best guess based off of what we know right now. So the next couple of slides, I'm just going to show you a few pictures of wild bees to hopefully give you a new search image rather than honeybee the first time you think of a bee. The first one is a small carpenter bee, or Serie. This is it's kind of a small bee. It likes to nest in blackberry stems or rosebush stems. It actually chews into those little stems and makes its nest in a very neat row. A lot of you have probably seen large carpenter bees or eastern carpenter bees. So this is one of their relatives. They can come in beautiful deep blue hues. Some of them are dark green. There's also sweat bees, which a lot of people are familiar with. And a sweat bee can be a lot of different kinds of bees. This one is one of the teeny tiny ones that we call Lasioglossum, and it's a really nice dark green color. There's some that are dark black that have some orange on them. And if you see on this bee's hind leg, it has a bunch of pink dots on it. Those are all individual pollen grains. So again, this bee has scopy, or those specialized hairs on its hind leg to help collect pollen grains. And the last bee, let me get the slide to go here, is a bumblebee. So these are relatively large wild bees. They're very hairy, they're very loud. Maybe some of you, even by the end of this, will even associate the word cute with this image. So as you go out into natural areas, these are the organisms that you should be thinking about that are carrying out these pollination services, right? These are the species that have existing relationships with the native plants that we see. Do we have any questions before we move on to bumblebee ecology, just about general pollinators?
Nothing outstanding, Katie.
Okay. Well, with that, we will move right into the value of bumblebees. So bumblebees are a unique pollinator for a few different reasons, and we're going to look at their physiology, their intelligence, them being a long-tongued species, as well as their innovation. So when we talk about physiology, bumblebees are a relatively large species of bee, right? We have some really tiny bees, but bumblebees they're a big bee. And because of that, they have proportionately large muscles, and they're able to use these muscles to induce shivering. And when they do this, they can generate a lot of heat. And their ability to generate this heat allows them to fly in cooler temperatures, maybe earlier in the day or later in the day than we might see a lot of our other smaller pollinators. So they have more opportunity to go out and pollinate. And one of the ways that we classify wild bees is by their tongue length. So some of our wild bees are considered short-tongued, and some of them are considered long-tongued. In the case of bumblebees, they are long-tongued. Let me get my pointer out here. So if you see in this picture, this is the bumblebee's tongue. And in these photos, the bee is sticking their tongue all the way back into these floral spurs. And the value of this is that bumblebees are able to pollinate a wide variety of flowers because they can reach back into these long-tubed flowers, whereas some of our short-tongued bees might not be able to do so. And bumblebees are also capable of buzz pollinating. This is a specific behavior that a few different types of bees can carry out. Bumblebees are pretty well known for it and are used in a lot of commercial greenhouses to carry this out because it's efficient for the type of flower that a tomato or a pepper might produce. And so buzz pollination happens by the bumblebee sort of grabbing on to the anthers of the plant, which are about right here. And again, using those large muscles, the bumblebee is able to shake herself and basically vibrate this plant so much that the pollen grains are dislodged and they fall onto her belly. And she's able to groom them onto her hind legs. So 8% of plants can benefit from buzz pollination, and it can include tomatoes, peppers, like I mentioned in the greenhouses, but also a lot of our native plants, manzanitas, flax lilies, pitcher plants, shooting stars. And here we have a little GIF of buzz pollination happening. So you can see the bee is vibrating the flower, and it's actually causing that pollen grain to fall out of the plant. You can see the little white powder there coming out at the end. It's pretty neat. And if you get to observe this in the wild, you can actually hear it happening. It's a very high-pitched buzz. So if you stand near your tomatoes in the summertime, you might get to witness this. And next, let me see if I can get this video to work. It's been testing, but this video is going to show how bumblebees can be trained and exhibit cognitive flexibility and can then teach their friends what they just learned. See if it wants to play for us today. Okay, so here is training for the bumblebee. They're showing the bee, if you get the ball to the center here, we'll give you a nectar reward, kind of like you would train any animal. You give them a treat at the end when they've done something good. So the bee discovers there's nectar in there. She's like, okay, I can do this. So then after training, the bee takes the ball to the center by herself and gets her nectar reward. And then here she's going to show her friend, hey, if we put the ball in the center here, we'll get a reward. And then they can actually choose the most efficient path. So these balls are placed at different distances from the center, and the bee chooses the one that's the shortest distance away to get the reward the fastest. So these are pretty intelligent creatures that we're dealing with. And honestly, this is probably only the surface that we've even scratched with them. So when we look at their ecology, we know there's about 3,600 wild bees in the United States, but how many different kinds of bumblebees do we think there are in the United States? So take another second here. How many different kinds of bumblebees? If you read the webinar announcement, you know that there is 10 in Missouri. But how many in the United States? Looks like people are split between 40 and 50 or 50 or 60.
Bumpers and splitters.
Okay, looks a couple more trickling in. Okay, well, most of you got that one right. There are about 47 different species in the United States. So when we look at bumblebee diversity, in the map here, you can see the hotspots. So each little red square means there is a lot of different species of bumblebees in that area. About 23 to 24 different species exist in the red areas on the map. And you can see that those areas of red are out west or following along a mountain. Along the spine is where we see a lot of different kinds of bumblebee species as you go up in elevation. In Missouri, there's about 10 different species. And the way that bumblebees work, they are a social colony. So like honeybees, they have a queen, they have workers, they have male bees, but they're only active for one season. So we say they have an annual life cycle. So we see bumblebees active in Missouri from about April to October, November, depending on the year. You know, if there's a lot of flowering resources still available late in the season, if it's not too cold, the bumblebees might be out for a longer time in the fall. But each year, the colony is founded by a single queen. So in April, a queen will come out and start a new colony every year. Depending on the species and again, the number of flowering resources in the area or nesting availability, parasite loads, a colony can have between 25 or more than 500 workers. So it can really vary there on the size of the colony. And bumblebees like to nest in something that's already insulated, right? So they like to rent a place. They don't like to build their nest from scratch. And they like to use things like abandoned rodent burrows or at the base of bunch grasses, some unmowed areas, rock walls. Sometimes you'll find them in bird boxes. They like exposed insulation in the siding of houses. They're advantageous to where they can nest as long as there's some insulation there for them. And the way the life cycle works, this is an image here that goes from winter all the way to, let me get the pointer out. So we have spring over here, goes through summer, fall, and then winter. So starting in the bottom left here, let me turn this pointer off. Sorry about that. The queen emerges, and in Missouri, this can vary for species, but we start to see them in early April, sometimes late March, depending on the year. And the queen will emerge, so she'll spend a few weeks flying around looking for a nice place to nest. Again, she's looking for somewhere messy that has insulation. And then she'll start collecting food and creating waxen pots to lay her first batch of eggs. So at this point in the season, it is the queen maintaining the whole colony, right? And it's herself and a couple of eggs. And as the time goes on and her first couple of batches of eggs hatch and then finally emerge into adults, the workers are slowly going to take over all of the tasks of the colony. So they're going to spend their time foraging, they're going to spend their time defending the nest, helping the queen with whatever she needs. And the queen is going to stay in the nest and just continually lay eggs. So the summer is when we see the highest numbers of bumblebees out on the colony or out on the landscape because the colony is growing. Towards the end of summer and the beginning of fall is when we see new queens and males being produced. So they're both going to leave the colony when it's time to mate, and the males do not generally return to the colony after they've left. So they're just going to stay out on the landscape, and they're all going to try their hardest to mate with that queen as she emerges. And after the queen is mated, she's going to spend a couple of weeks foraging, building up her energy reserves, and then look for a place to spend the winter. So the new queen is the only individual from the colony that will survive that year, and she will basically hibernate until the following year. The foundress queen, all of the workers, and the males are all going to die off, right? So this is why we call it an annual life cycle, because it's only active for 1 year. And so once that newly mated queen overwinters and the soil temperatures heat up the following year, she's going to emerge and start that whole process over again. And then we have cuckoo bumblebees. So if anyone is familiar with cuckoo birds, there are also cuckoo bumblebees. And these are species that don't build their own nest. Instead, they infiltrate the nest of a regular bumblebee. And they only produce queens and males, so there are no workers here. The workers that help raise the young of a cuckoo bee are the workers of that original nest that the cuckoo invades. So when the cuckoo bee is trying to invade the nest, she has to do it at a very strategic point, right? She wants to do it when there are enough workers that they will raise her young, but not so many that they will kill her during her time of invasion. So when this cuckoo bee invades the nest, her goal is to kill that original queen and then lay her own eggs and have that queen's workers raise her egg. Raise her eggs and young. These bees look a little bit different from regular bumblebees. They have a little bit sparser hairs. Their exoskeleton is a little bit thicker. And when I say exoskeleton, I basically mean the body of the bee. It's kind of like a fingernail is what a bee exoskeleton might feel like. So they're a little bit tougher, probably because they have to arm themselves from being killed. And yes, so before I hand it over to Rich, we can go over some questions.
Yeah, Katie, there are some good questions here. One, are bumblebees with longer tongues typically the species in decline?
Do you know the answer to that one?
I do. Well, I will say that sort of when we look at these things globally, it seems to be different than when we look at them here in the United States. So on a global scale, or at least in Europe, where these things have been looked at, tongue length has been somewhat correlated with decline. We've not found similar patterns of decline here in the US. In fact, the 4 species that seem to be experiencing some of the most serious declines are largely our short-tongued species. And so, yeah, in say Europe and the UK, a lot of the long-tongued species decline has been attributed to the loss of clover on the landscape and potential other flower losses, but we've not seen similar things here in the US. Another question, do bumblebees sting or bite?
Yes, bumblebees do sting. They can't bite. But most times when a bee stings you, it's either an accident because we've stepped on them or gotten them in the crease of your elbow somehow. But when a bumblebee is out foraging, that's the time that we usually see them. And they are so busy trying to collect food and get it back to the nest that they don't want to waste time stinging you. So once you understand that, you can actually get pretty close to bumblebees and just observe them, and they won't have anything to do with you. But if you do get near the nest and there's a lot of them there, they can get defensive and they will be inclined to sting. So again, it depends on the situation you're in, but most times the bumblebees do not want to sting.
How long does it take for the eggs to hatch? And how many reproductive cycles does the queen typically have in a season?
How many reproductive cycles? I don't know the exact number to that one. It probably depends on the species, but a lot of that will go into how many resources are out and available for them. If there's a lot of foraging resources available and they can grow their colony quicker, the queen will be able to lay more eggs that season. I don't see the
And then
question.
how long from egg to adult?
From egg to adult is about 14 days.
Is there only one queen from each colony?
No. Some colonies can produce 1 to 2 queens in the end, but some species can produce many in the hundreds. But I think most of them, it's going to be on the smaller side.
Yes. Another interesting question here. What is the relative abundance of true bumblebees versus cuckoo bumblebees?
A lot smaller in abundance. I have never seen a cuckoo bumblebee in the wild. They are out there, but they are not as abundant as regular bumblebees at all. One day I'll see
Katie,
one.
I'm shocked that you've never seen.
I know.
bumblebee in the
It's because I keep saying that. They're just hiding.
I see them fairly regularly in the West. I mean, they're certainly not nearly as abundant as our workers and other bumblebees, but sometimes, especially in the fall, males can be quite abundant in places. I would say they're locally abundant, but not, they don't anywhere near the number of individuals you'd see. I mean, just by number of species, you know, of the bumblebee species in Missouri, there's 10 species. 2 cuckoos, Katie, or just
2, and
yeah,
one
2
of them
cuckoos.
is
So
considered very rare.
yeah, so
So
just by
lucky-
number of species alone, they're going to be much more rare. But then they're also just not sort of out in the middle of the summer when we would see other species as well. So anyway, an interesting question. Good question. Questions just keep coming in here. Oh, another stinging question. People love stinging questions. Can they sting more than once? And do they lose their stinger?
Bumblebees can sting more than once, yes.
And they don't lose their stinger, which is why they can sting more than once. So honeybees have like a barb on the back on their stinger. They're sort of more adapted for that defense mode while they protect a large resource of honey and the queen. And bumblebees just don't have, because they're an annual life cycle, and they just don't spend the same amount of resources in a protective mode. So they haven't adapted that multiples or that barbed stinger, which leads to the release of pheromones and attracts other honeybees to come to the defense, which is part of the adaptation there. And bumblebees don't have that. Have there been any recent sightings of the American bumblebee, Bombus pennsylvanicus?
Yes, last year. So the Atlas launched last August. So we had people out looking and surveying for about 2 months, and we had quite a few Bombus pennsylvanicus sightings come in.
There's a question here about the difference between male and female bumblebees and whether we can tell the difference. And I'll just say we're going to address that when we talk about identifying bumblebees on Thursday. So I'm going to table that question. The short answer is yes, but you need some training. So we'll go over how to do that on Thursday. Are prospective queens raised differently than workers? I think the question sort of relates to like what makes a queen versus a worker.
What makes a queen versus a worker?
Yeah, so when an egg is laid, like why does that individual develop into a queen versus a worker?
Are bumblebees fed with royal jelly like the honeybees in here?
No, I think there's some uncertainties about this. It seems to be largely just amount of resources that, at least my understanding is, it seems to be the amount of resources that are fed to that individual and dedicated to them. So partially it's just at that point, the colony is bringing in more and more resources. So more resources are available to those individuals and fed to them. And so they get more robust and their ovaries develop because they have more more resources fed to them and dedicated to them. There's a question about banana smell. I don't know the answer to this. This is a testable hypothesis though, and it should be tested, but I don't know anything about bananas attracting bumblebees personally.
Nor do I. You know that you can attract moths at night with banana smell, but I haven't tried with bumblebees.
Yeah. There's a question here about nesting structures that would attract queens. I will say that I've experimented with this, some in my graduate work and some sort of in my adult life as I have, gardened and built homes. I've tried a lot of different structures. I've had middling success at best. I think there are lots of different structures that could work. I think what you put inside that structure is probably more important than the structure itself. As Katie mentioned, bumblebees need some sort of insulation or cavity in which to build their nest. They typically use, like abandoned rodent burrows that would, be full of insulation. And so creating a ball of insulation, a lot of people recommend using like couch or futon batters cotton that's like sold in 2-inch things. You can sort of pull it apart and make a cavity in the middle of it and then put it in some structure. I will say that there's an individual by the name of Dave Goulson. He's a bumblebee conservation expert based in the UK, and he has a YouTube channel, and he recently released a YouTube video about how to do this in your garden. So it's worth checking that out if you'd like some more information. And there are some species, I notice people are saying old chickadee nests and things in here, and there are some species that do nest in above the ground in abandoned bird nests. And there are some species actually like the American bumblebee that just nest right on the surface of the ground. And so some of the best things to do to encourage them to inhabit your home or nest near you would be to consider how you're managing your habitat. And we'll talk some about that in the next session here.
Yeah, and we can drop that YouTube channel in the link. There's another one in here about, can you assume that the bumblebee you observed in the woods last week would have been a queen? Yes and no. There is a species, the 2-spotted bumblebee, that emerges pretty early. So there is a chance that that one can have workers out already. But if it was a large bumblebee, chances are it was a queen. How much bigger is the queen than others? Again, dependent on species, but if you see a large bee out in the past 3 weeks or so, it was probably a queen. The queens can get up to about 1.5 inches or so, and the workers never reach that size.
There's a question here about more resources equaling more queens in the colony.
Yes, I would. I would think so. The more resources there are,
Yeah,
the more
yeah,
they're going to be
definitely.
able to grow and produce more
Definitely.
eggs at the end, hopefully.
Definitely.
But there's also some other factors that would feed into that.
Lots of interesting questions pouring in here. There's a question about bumblebees being attracted to carbon dioxide. I don't know anything about that. I don't believe they are attracted to carbon dioxide like mosquitoes are. I don't think there's any attractive that I am aware of. I have seen some bumblebees at hummingbird feeders. They'll occasionally come and get some nectar or sugar from there, but not frequently, not like honeybees. Honeybees collect a lot more nectar than bumblebees do. I might leave this Atlas question for you, Katie, and maybe you can type an answer there while I'm giving the next section here.
Yeah, I'm also going to launch a poll just to see. Done with that one. You guys can just fill out this poll. We're trying to get an accurate number of how many people are attending tonight. And in regards to Linda's question, I would say log on to the Missouri Bumble Bee Atlas Facebook page, where it is a closed group just for other Atlas volunteers. And if you'd like to have somebody out at your property or help them, 40 acres sounds like it would be a wonderful place, especially if you're already doing prairie conservation, to survey for bees. So I would join that Facebook group and reach out to other volunteers to see if any are in your area. Oh, let me stop sharing my screen. Sorry, Rich.
Derek, the upholster's cotton was the word that I was looking for earlier. Yes, upholster's cotton is the good nesting material that people use to put in boxes.
Do both male and female species sting? No, only females have that stinger because it is a modified ovipositor. So it's an egg laying mechanism basically. So males do not have a stinger.
Tiffany, if a colony produces a bunch of queens, they seem to be fairly amicable in the nest. They do return to the nest and continue to reap benefits from the resources being pulled in, and they'll continue to feed until they've reached some threshold where then they seek their hibernacula. But certainly they don't attack each other. At least I don't know any evidence of that in what I know about bumblebee ecology.
And the 5 to 6 flying around your backyard, how are they all queens? There's a chance that you either have really wonderful habitat and they're all trying to find a place there, or they could be carpenter bees. A lot of people are seeing carpenter bees out right now, which look very similar to bumblebees. They're all black. They have that loud, intimidating buzz, but they like to nest in wood. So if you have like a wooden deck somewhere or some nice fence posts and you see 1/2-inch size holes, you probably are seeing carpenter bees. They also have a very shiny abdomen.
But it could be that you're just seeing a lot of bumblebee queens. They can live in fairly dense areas, especially, just because you have a bunch of queens flying around doesn't mean that they're all going to be successful. There's likely a lot more queens that fly around in the spring that found successful colonies that move on to produce reproductives. It's just the nature of insect ecology. There's a lot of nest failure, or likely a lot of nest failure. So it sure could be that there are a lot of queens flying around. Should we move on, Katie?
Yes, let's do that.
Okay. All right. Katie's given a really nice introduction to the ecology of bumblebees and why we spend so much attention. Some information has come out about their conservation. And so now we're going to dedicate this next session here to better understanding the threats that bumblebees face, as well as what we can do about it. And I will say up front that this is probably not the most uplifting evening conversation that we're going to have. There are certainly some concerning things that are going on in the world that are creating problems for bumblebees. But I think one of the really nice things about pollinator conservation is that there's something we can all do about it. It's a solvable problem in that we've created a lot of issues, but we can do a lot to reverse them. And so while I'm going to go through these threats and some declines, we'll try to end with some of the conservation efforts that are ongoing, and more of that will come on Thursday when we talk about the survey efforts and ongoing efforts to learn more about bumblebee ecology and conservation so that we can do a better job creating habitat, which is one of the main reasons that we're conducting this Bumble Bee Atlas project in Missouri. One is to learn more about the status of bumblebees in Missouri, find out where populations are thriving and where they're not. And another main reason is so we can learn more about their habitat associations and learn more about the plants that they're using, so that organizations like the Missouri Department of Conservation, when they're building habitat on the lands that they manage, they can use evidence-based to help these populations recover. And so that's one of the main goals of this program, is to learn more so that we can improve on-the-ground conservation efforts, both now and far into the future. Most people don't really recognize or understand that our understanding of bumblebees and most other pollinators is decades behind our understanding of most mammals and birds. We have very little ecological association information, as well as almost no population level sort of measure of population biology and population genetics. And so the pollinator world is well behind here, and efforts like this to understand more are extremely needed and extremely beneficial. So again, thank you all for being here tonight, and we'll roll through our understanding of bumblebee ecology and conservation in North America. The story of bumblebee conservation really starts, it starts a heck of a long time ago with the revolution. But in North America, we really started learning about bumblebee decline in the late 2000s. So around 2005, 2006, 2007, there was a gentleman by the name of Robin Thorpe. He was conducting some research in California at the time, looking at two of the species that you see on this page, the Western bumblebee and Franklin's bumblebee. And he was surveying a number of sites and trying to sort of measure their populations through time. And I guess fortunately, but also unfortunately, while he was conducting these surveys, those two species completely disappeared from his field sites over the course of about 3 years. Concurrently, there were some researchers looking at the rusty-patched bumblebee and the yellow-banded bumblebee on the East Coast of the United States. And around the same time, those two species started disappearing as well. 3 of these species, the Western bumblebee, the yellow-banded bumblebee, and the rusty-patched bumblebee, have expansive ranges covering large portions of the United States. So in this course, and southern Canada, I should add. And in this case, we're talking about broadly distributed common animals that disappeared virtually overnight. Franklin's bumblebee is a little bit of a different case. It has a very small range. It's restricted to southern Oregon and northern California, in a range that's about 120 miles long and about 30 to 50 miles wide. It's a very small area that it once inhabited, and it may have the smallest range of about any bumblebee species in the world. All 4 of these bumblebee species have been petitioned for endangered species status or protection under the Endangered Species Act. The Western bumblebee is currently being considered by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for endangered listing. Its final decision, I believe, will be made in 2023. Franklin's bumblebee has been proposed endangered by the Fish and Wildlife Service, and a final ruling is due out any month at this point. The yellow-banded bumblebee was petitioned for endangered species status, and the service determined that listing was not warranted. And the rusty patch bumblebee is also listed, like Franklin's bumblebee. It was proposed listed as endangered and then finally added to the Endangered Species Act as an endangered species in 2016. And this species is important to note just because far eastern Missouri could potentially be habitat for this species. I believe there is a record in far eastern Missouri. And so survey efforts there should certainly consider whether the rusty patch bumblebee could be present. And we'll share some more information about that on Thursday when we talk about surveying throughout the state in particular areas. So as these 4 species started to become in decline, a lot of people started to ask questions and think about what the next best steps were for helping these animals to recover. And part of that conversation resulted in the development of the Bumblebee Specialist Group. And the Bumblebee Specialist Group is nested under the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, or the IUCN. And the IUCN is an international group whose goal is to assess the extinction risk of a lot of animals and plants and fungi and other organisms on the planet. And so a bumblebee specialist group was formed with the goal of assessing the extinction risk of bumblebees throughout North America. Every colored area that you see on this map is an area that has native bumblebee species. So they're restricted largely to the Northern Hemisphere, except there's a fairly robust suite of bumblebee species that also thrive throughout South America. But most of Africa, Australia, New Zealand, and the Pacific Islands have no native bumblebee species. There's around 250 species of bumblebees worldwide. We mentioned there's around 50 here in North America. And so the task was to assess the extinction risk of all of these animals. We've now finished this analysis for the bumblebees of the New World. So those in North, Meso, and South America have been studied. And what we learned in North America is that it's more than just those 4 species that were in decline. Around a quarter of the bumblebee species in the United States and North America are facing some degree of extinction risk, which means they're in an IUCN threatened category of near threatened or above. And so this chart here represents that, but it also shows the different categories that animals can be assessed as. So in North America, we have 4 species that are critically endangered, 2 that are listed as endangered, 5 that are listed as vulnerable, and 1 that's listed as near threatened. But interestingly, at least from a conservation perspective, we also have 28 species that are listed as least concern, whose populations seem to be stable or potentially even increasing. And so this is an interesting conservation conundrum of sorts when you have animals that overlap in the spaces that they share, but some of them are declining and some of them are not. And so figuring out what the biology or ecology is of these particular species that are in decline has been something that we've been working on for the last 15 years or so. And I don't have any great answers for this. There's a lot of questions out there, and we're going to go through some of the ongoing threats or understood threats to this point. Here in the central United States, in Missouri and nearby, there are a number of species, 9 species that are in the IUCN risk category. So the rusty patch bumblebee, we've already talked about. The western bumblebee is found in far western Nebraska, so not too far from the area. And in northern central US is Bombus terricola. And a number of these species were once found in Missouri. So the rusty patch bumblebee, the variable cuckoo bumblebee, the southern plains bumblebee, the yellow bumblebee, and the American bumblebee are all, or at least once called Missouri home. The variable cuckoo bumblebee hasn't been detected in quite some time anywhere in the US. It was recently petitioned for endangered species status. I mentioned the records in far eastern Missouri. We have been detecting the southern plains bumblebee fairly regularly throughout Missouri. Even in the first year of the Atlas, we had some detections, and would love to find the yellow bumblebee. And we'll talk more about that next or on Thursday night. And we've already talked a little bit about the American bumblebee and the detections that we've had over the last couple of years. So what's happening? Why are these animals in decline, or why are some of them in decline and why are others not in decline? There's no sort of smoking gun here. We believe that there are a lot of factors that are happening. As I roll through these threats, you'll see some of that. And it's likely not only that each of these factors is acting alone, but there are interactions between these factors. In other words, sometimes you might have a bee that's stressed by its unique biology and genetics and decreasing food supply. And then all of a sudden you throw a pesticide at it, or you add disease into the mix, and you get an animal that can no longer fight, can no longer meet the needs. And then this can lead to something called an extinction debt. And eventually things get put over the threshold that potentially lead to these dramatic declines that we've seen. But largely, we believe there's four main drivers of bumblebee decline, at least here in North America. Habitat loss is a major one, pesticides, managed pollinators, and climate change. And I'm going to go through each one of these individually, and then we'll talk some about the interaction of these things towards the end. So as with a lot of species that we've seen decline in the United States and other places, habitat loss is a major one. So realistically, we've taken a lot of grasslands and prairies that once, provided flowering resources for almost half the year, from early spring through late fall. And we've converted a lot of those into farm fields. And while farm fields may provide flowering resources, the flowering period for those plants is usually closer to 2 weeks instead of 16, 20, 24, or even 30 weeks that we would see from a native grassland or prairie. And as we learned from the ecology section from Katie, bumblebees have a fairly long life cycle. It's several weeks from egg to adult. And that process of having to go through several iterations of that until the colony can produce queens, or the reproductive members of the colony, mean that they need flowering resources over a long period of time. So when we do things that reduce the availability or reduce the length of time that flowering resources are available, we're having significant impacts on bumblebee populations. And this isn't just happening in farm fields, it's also happening in our urban and suburban areas, as we have taken areas that once provided habitat and we've converted them into green lawns or into baseball stadiums and roads. And of course, we all need places to live and we all want entertainment. But one of the things that we need to do is think about how to create functional landscapes integrated with these. We know that bumblebees can thrive in urban and suburban areas, but they need habitat. And one of the interesting things is when you look at something like a green lawn, lawns just have a very, very small food web. There's very few animals that live in them and can call them habitat. And so, and certainly without flowering resources in that lawn, it's not going to provide any flowering resources or food for pollinators. But when you introduce some sort of meadow ecosystem into your yard, it doesn't even have to be in the form of the entire yard, but even in a small garden, all of a sudden you can vastly increase the food web and interactions that are happening there. And one of the great things about having a lot of interactions in your garden is then all of a sudden we have a functional ecology or a functional ecosystem. And when that happens, it means that you have predators and prey. And this really affects or reduces our need to rely on chemicals to solve problems, right? When we have pests in our garden, if we have a predator to come eat that pest, then all of a sudden that pest doesn't cause an outbreak. It doesn't actually cause a problem. And so creating functional ecosystems is a really important part of creating habitat throughout our urban and suburban ecosystems. And as we start mentioning pesticides, which is the next threat that we're going to talk about, it's really important to think about exposure pathways for bees. And one of the reasons that this is important, I don't want to get too into the weeds here, but all the pesticides that are approved for use in the United States they go through a process. And largely, at least to date, and this is beginning to change, but largely that process studies the effect of these chemicals on honeybees. And largely, honeybees live in boxes. They can be moved around. And they almost always live above ground. And so while these three exposure pathways here of direct contact, indirect contact, and systemic contact, and we'll talk a little bit more about what systemic contact is in a little bit, all of these relate to honeybees, and those matter. But honeybees aren't collecting plant material to line their nests with, and they're also not nesting directly in the ground. So we have very little understanding of how these exposure pathways are affecting our native bees, like bumblebees, and in this case with contaminated nest materials, like with mason bees or leafcutter bees, are of concern there. So those are the things that really concern us when we think about insecticides and bumblebees. We don't fully understand how they even affect bumblebees and other native bee populations because they just haven't been tested. But some of them have been tested, and one of the main culprits that you're probably familiar with is a class of insecticides called neonicotinoids. And neonicotinoids are basically nicotine-based. They're a neurotoxin, but they're also water-soluble, which means that they're systemic. And so when they're applied to a plant, they get into the water table and they are expressed in every tissue of the plant that has water flowing through it, which means that they're in the stems, they're in the leaves, but they're also found in the pollen and in the nectar. And so every time that a bee or another pollinator visits a flower and drinks nectar or eats pollen, and you now know that pollen is the main source or the only source of protein for bees, and so they eat it, and they also feed their young pollen. In fact, they make these balls of pollen to bring back to their nest to lay their eggs on. And so anytime a bee is collecting pollen from a plant that's been treated, it has a micro dose of this insecticide in it. And so it may not be a lethal dose, but certainly could be what we call a sublethal dose. So while it's not going to cause direct or immediate mortality, over the long run, we know these chemicals reduce foraging efficiency. We know that they reduce the ability of bees to navigate. And when we study these things in bumblebee populations, we find that nests that are treated with these chemicals or that are exposed to these chemicals, they produce fewer queens, smaller colonies, et cetera, et cetera. So these things are likely having population level effects, even if they're not causing immediate or direct mortality. One of the scary things about these plants also is that they're extremely persistent, especially in woody plants. After a single treatment to a woody plant, they can be found up to 7 years later. So they're extremely long-lived and extremely toxic. And one of the other problems with them is that their byproducts are also toxic. So as they break down through time in the soil and in the water table, the byproducts can also be toxic to bees and other invertebrates. When most people, and the map that you see here is the use of one of these chemicals, one of these neonicotinoids called imidacloprid, And it was introduced in the mid-1990s, and you can see that its use has exploded throughout much of the United States. It's important to recognize, though, that this map only reflects agricultural use and not urban or suburban use. But urban and suburban use is also a major concern for the use of these chemicals. This is an event that happened in Wilsonville, Oregon in 2012, where a series of European linden trees in the genus Tilia were treated with one of these neonicotinoid chemicals that was sprayed on the trees while they were in bloom. And unfortunately, during this time, they were also being visited by thousands upon thousands of bumblebees. And we were called onto the scene. And as you sort of zoom into this parking space here, you'll notice a lot of black dots on the ground. And every black dot that you see there is a bumblebee. And as we zoom in a little bit closer, you can just see that the density of bumblebees under these trees was tremendous. And it wasn't just this one tree. I think there were 67 trees in the parking lot that were all treated. And we estimated that somewhere between 50 and 100,000 bumblebees and over 150 different colonies were affected by this event. One of the concerning things here is that if this happens sort of in a grassy field somewhere, no one may ever know. And so this is likely going on all over North America as people are using some of these highly toxic chemicals in ornamental settings where their use is probably not appropriate. In this case, the chemical was sprayed to remove aphids from these trees because aphids were dropping honeydew on cars in the parking lot. And aphids can be treated with soapy water or high pressure water. So certainly a highly toxic insecticide that's long lived in these trees was highly unnecessary. And this is a long way of just showing that it's really not just agricultural use that's a problem for insecticides and bumblebee populations. In fact, if you look at this bar here, reflects the amount of money that's spent on insecticides in agricultural versus home and garden. So you can see there's actually more money coming with insecticides coming from the home and garden market than there is from the agricultural community. And this is significant. And we also find this when we look at streams. So if we look at concentration of these chemicals when we're looking at water as it's flowing through streams and rivers, we find higher concentrations in urban and suburban areas than we do in agricultural areas. So the usage data seems to agree with the financial data here. And part of the reason here is that farmers have an economic incentive to use these chemicals only when necessary because they're expensive and they change the ecology of a place, whereas a homeowner has very little, they haven't gotten a pesticide applicator's license, but they can use the same chemicals, sometimes at much higher concentrations. And the homeowner generally will think that more is better and will continue to spray these chemicals, even though their effects are long-lived, especially in woody plants. And so this kill that we talked about here, led to the death of many different bumblebees, and hopefully also has led to some positive impacts in that now the state of Oregon bans the use of this chemical on tilia trees, and there's been a larger conversation about how these chemicals are labeled. They can no longer be labeled on blooming plants, et cetera, et cetera. So hopefully these bumblebees did not die in vain, but it was certainly a tragic event and highly unnecessary. In addition to this, the plant supplier industry is also could be a potential source of neonicotinoids in your home garden as well. A lot of these nurseries use systemic neonicotinoids before they even reach the shelves, especially in some of the larger box stores. I believe there was a study that came out a number of years ago that tested perennial plants in some of these larger box stores and found that nearly 100% of the perennials had been pre-treated with neonicotinoids, which means that when you bring them back to your home and plant them to attract bees and other pollinators, that you're actually poisoning them, which is just an absolutely tragic thing to have happen. And so we're really encouraging people to check your sources of where you're finding plants and making sure that you're talking with your providers and asking the question, have these been pre-treated with a systemic insecticide? If the answer is yes, we suggest that you take your business somewhere else. If the answer is, I don't know, we suggest that you take your business somewhere else and recommend to them that they find out. And if their answer is yes, then I would, certainly source your plants there and recommend that other people do as well. Xerces also has some resources available for you. We have there's a webinar that called Buying Bee Safe Plants, how you can help. And we have a companion manual called Buying Bee Safe Plants. Both are available, or one of them is available from our YouTube channel, and the other one is available from our website. And maybe Katie could drop some links in the chat there for you. We have a lot more information about pesticides as well in our resource center. So feel free to use the webinars and materials that we've put together for homeowners. In addition to habitat loss and pesticides, commercial bumblebees are also a major factor in the declines, and they're believed to be one of the leading factors in decline of those 4 species that I mentioned at the beginning of this talk. Excuse me. So human beings like tomatoes, and we like to eat tomatoes year round. So we're innovative people, and we learned how to grow tomatoes in greenhouses. Novel solution to a novel problem. Katie also told you that bumblebees are really good buzz pollinators of tomatoes and can increase fruit set. So when we grow tomatoes in greenhouses, bumblebees can't visit them, so fruit set's lower. So what we did as human beings is we learned how to grow bumblebees in boxes. Again, a novel solution to a novel problem. We now can distribute those boxes of bumblebees to greenhouses and other places to increase pollination services, increase fruit set, and make tomatoes available in February and March when they ordinarily wouldn't be. Unfortunately, when you take an animal that normally reproduces at fairly low density and you force it into a laboratory, you introduce the possibility of disease. And it's believed that in these facilities, there was a novel pathogen, or not a novel pathogen, but a pathogen was contracted and some resistance was built up. And then colonies were shipped all over North America that had this fungal pathogen called Nosema bombi in them. And then as these commercial bumblebees were pollinating in greenhouses, they were going in and out of windows and interacting with the neighboring bumblebees, and the neighboring bumblebees were coming inside to pollinate some tomatoes. And this fungal pathogen was then amplified and spread throughout North America. And it's believed that those 4 species that I talked about at the beginning of this, Franklin's bumblebee, the western bumblebee, the rusty patch bumblebee, and the yellow-banded bumblebee, were all uniquely susceptible to this pathogen or the other stressors it was facing, plus the pathogen was just too much, which caused some of these population declines. Unfortunately, this is an unregulated industry in the United States. No one basically tracks this industry, where they're being spread, where they're being used. Largely, these animals, as we understand it at least, are not tested for disease as they're spread out or shipped all over the country. So there's some real opportunities for change and growth here as we think about protecting our native pollinators. In addition to that, I think over the last couple of decades, since colony collapse disorder, a lot of people have gotten the message that becoming a beekeeper is a great way to save the bees. And that is just not true. Honeybees are wonderful animals, and there is a lot to be learned from them. They're social insects that are beautiful and are fun to watch and fun to interact with. But beekeeping is not bee conservation. Beekeeping is a hobby. It's like having a pet almost, and you get honey out of the deal, and it's great. If you want to be a beekeeper for those reasons, I would highly recommend it. It is a fun and exciting hobby. But we know that honeybees compete with native bees for resources. There's limited resources on the planet. I've already told you that. And honeybees have, 10 to 50,000 mouths to feed. So every time you introduce a honeybee colony, you're decreasing the flowering resources that are available for the native bees in that area. We also know that honeybees can transmit diseases to native bees and to bumblebees. And so would really encourage you that if you're interested in bee conservation and you don't really want to be a beekeeper, that you create habitat instead. Or if you are a beekeeper, you should also be creating habitat. A honeybee colony, a single honeybee colony probably needs between a half acre and an acre of habitat in order to support itself. So we need to be creating habitat. In addition to all the pressures we've talked about already, there's also the additional pressure of climate change. We've all experienced earlier springs, more extreme weather. This is forcing bumblebees up into northern latitudes, or at least being lost from their southern latitudes, and they're also being pushed up into higher elevations, and also could potentially over the long term shorten seasons, which reduces the ability for reproduction to occur, and potentially cause a mismatch in the emergence time of plants and their pollinators. So lots of concern here with climate change and lots of uncertainty as well. And so we've talked about all of these factors individually, but obviously there's not just one of them acting on any individual population or any individual species. They're all interacting with each other. And so, you take a bee that's already stressed by poor nutrition and climate and habitat loss, and all of a sudden you add insecticides and pathogens on top of it, and you get a situation where a bee just can't resist that. And so there's a study that was done recently by Sydney Cameron and Ben Sad that looked at global trends in bumblebee health. And I titled this slide, "How Strong is the Camel's Back?" There's just so much going on and so many different factors that could lead to decline that we just really need to think about what we can do as a society to reduce stressors. 1 out of 3 bites of food that we put in our body comes from a plant that was dependent on an insect for pollination services. And so if we want to continue to enjoy our nutritious and delicious food sources, we need to do a better job of protecting our pollinators. And as Katie mentioned, they're not just feeding us, they're also feeding the bulk of the wildlife on the planet that eat fruits, nuts, seeds, and roots, which is, everything from songbirds to grizzly bears. And so there are, as I've mentioned throughout this, there are a lot of uncertainties going on in the threats with bumblebees. We don't know specific causes. We have a lot of sort of basic understanding, but we don't have any causal studies that showed, this happened and led to a decline. We have a lot of evidence that we've built up. But at this point, we believe that we're at the situation where there's enough evidence that we know that insect populations are in decline, and we know that something needs to be done about it. And we need to start acting now, even if we don't have the best solution or the perfect solution. Every bit of habitat we put on the landscape, every little action that we do makes a difference, which is something unique for bumblebee populations and pollinator conservation that is not true for, say, a polar bear. You can't create habitat for polar bears in your backyard and have them show up, but you can create habitat in your backyard for bumblebees and have them show up, and they will. It is truly a build it and they will come scenario, which brings us to hopefully a more uplifting end to this section of what are the conservation efforts that are going on throughout North America. What Xerces doing, and what can you do? Basically, our solution to these problems is to create habitat, and habitat is basically the solution to all of these problems. Habitat means 4 things. We need to put food on the ground, and the food needs to be available from early spring through late fall. We need to protect places for bumblebees to nest and overwinter. We need to connect these landscapes. So food needs to be connected to shelter. Food needs to be collected to other food, and shelter needs to be connected to shelter. It's not necessary that all these areas need to be in one place, but they certainly need to be connected through corridors. So we need to think about conservation at a landscape scale or a community scale, and not just at a local level. And then pesticides. We really need to consider both the direct and indirect effects of pesticides, both herbicides and insecticides. And so what does this mean? This means that we have opportunities. We can create habitat anywhere. You can do it in your front yard. Your community can do it along roadsides. Your parks can do it along ball fields. We can do it in swales and other areas. We can let brownfields flower. We can do a lot to create habitat in a lot of different places and work together to do that. And starting with what food looks like, we really just need to create gardens and habitat that provide flowering resources from early spring through late fall. I know I've said that a number of times, but it is really a key point. Queens, all these queens that we were talking about at the end of the last season, if there aren't flowering resources that are available when they emerge from hibernation, they're not going to be able to successfully found a nest. Likewise, at the end of the season, if there aren't flowering resources available, that queen is not going to be able to build the fat reserve she needs to successfully survive the winter. So we need to do a better job of creating habitat and making sure that food is available year round. It's important to recognize that all plants are not equal. Native plants are better than non-native plants and cultivars because they need to reproduce, which means they have pollen and nectar in them. They haven't been selected just for the way that they look. They're naturally selected to attract pollinators and produce lots of pollen and nectar to do so. Native plants are also better because we have a lot of butterflies that need native plants in order to reproduce. Our non-native or garden plants can't provide host plants for the caterpillars. So that is another major reason to think about using native plants. Additionally, a lot of cultivars are actually non-functional. A lot of them have been bred to have double petals and be pretty, and these are used in a lot of commercial landscapes, but they actually provide no pollen and no nectar. They're essentially plastic flowers when it comes from a habitat perspective. So we need to be really careful about which plants we're using. We also want to select plants that haven't been pre-treated with neonicotinoids. Providing nesting habitat is easy. You get to be lazy. Just leave some grass unmowed. It doesn't have to be your entire yard. It could be a corner of your yard that you create a brush pile and let overgrow. Leave some rock piles, leave some messy areas in your yard. Essentially, we want to create diversity within the landscape and make sure that not everything is sterile and looks exactly the same. Most species of bumblebee are fairly flexible in their nesting habits, as Katie mentioned, and so creating these opportunities will attract species to nest in your area. Overwintering sites are different than nesting sites, as we've talked about, and so providing space for this is really important. Bumblebees, as far as we know, overwinter under leaf litter, in shallow cavities in the ground, and so doing things like leaving leaves throughout the year to protect overwintering insects and making sure that they stay through the early spring so that bumblebees can emerge. And to help encourage this, Bumblebees started a Leave the Leaves campaign last year. We really recommend that people, don't rake their leaves until early spring. I think St. Patrick's Day is the typical sort of recommended time frame to begin thinking about a time when you might rake your leaves. But leaving them certainly in gardens, in some of our more unkempt or bare ground areas is really important to protect bumblebees and a lot of other overwintering invertebrates. And then, we sort of need to think about all of these other opportunities that we have. Where can we create habitat? It could be your backyard, it could be rain gardens or curbs alongside urban streets. There's lots of different opportunities, and the more habitat we place on the ground, the more connectivity that we're going to create. So they're going to have skipping stones through some of these urban habitats, and then can think about using some of these long linear corridors that we have, like rivers and streams and even roadsides, and power lines and other rights of way corridors can be really important to help bumblebees and other pollinators connect. When it comes to pesticides, especially in ornamental settings, we really recommend thinking about a system approach. And what this means is that if you have some pest in your garden or around your home, it's likely that some component of your garden is missing. It could be a predator. It could be that you've placed a plant in a place that isn't best in terms of soil moisture and other content. It could be some nutrient is missing. And so bringing education back into your urban habitat can really, really help you to reduce the need for chemical inputs. A lot of these highly toxic insecticides have no place in ornamental settings, and certainly, unless there's some economic threshold, would certainly recommend that they not be used in most home settings. And this means rethinking what is damage. If you have holes in your leaves, it could be that you have leafcutter bees, and that's an opportunity to consider yourself lucky and try to find out where they're nesting. And so bringing education again back into our systems, and not just rethinking what constitutes damage, but rethinking what constitutes beauty. Beauty should be functional, and functional should be beautiful. And so this means our leaves might get a little brown, but that might mean that there's some Lepidoptera larvae that's feeding on that and benefiting from that. And creating a functional habitat is also beautiful. And so thinking about that is important. To help with this, Xerces has started a Bring Back the Pollinators campaign. It basically says 4 things. You're going to grow a variety of bee flowers from spring to fall. You're going to protect nests and provide places to overwinter. And you're going to avoid using pesticides and especially insecticides. And then share this with your neighbors. We have habitat signs so that you can do this. In addition to working with homeowners, we also work with larger land managers, things like the Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management and the Missouri Department of Conservation to provide land management guidelines. This is a set of guidelines that I wrote a few years ago called Conserving Bumblebees. We've distributed this to land managers throughout the United States. And then we also just have a treasure trove of resources available on our website. Really encourage you to use a lot of the free PDFs and other things that you can download. We also have a fair number of books that are available, including a bestseller called Attracting Native Pollinators, a pretty recent plant here, our book here called 100 Plants to Feed the Bees. And then we actually have a brand new book that just came out last month that's called 100 Plants to Feed the Monarchs. And so all these resources are available. Most of them are free download for you. And we hope that you will make good use of them. I think that's all I got, Katie. I'm happy to answer any questions if there are any.
Wonderful. Thanks, Rich. That was really nice. There's a couple of questions in here, largely relating to insecticide, pesticide. Are you familiar with research efforts on herbicides and development and behavior of honeybees? We say pesticides, but herbicides may also be playing a role in bumblebee decline.
Yeah, I'm not 100% up on the sort of latest research with this. My understanding is there are some herbicides that are classified as, I can't remember the exact term, but I'm going to say loosely toxic. That's not the right term to bumblebees. The larger concern with herbicides is the indirect effects. So, if you take a farm field with, say, glyphosate corn, and you can spray glyphosate on it to remove all of the weeds in between, those corns, then all of that flowering habitat or weeds that once provided habitat is gone. And this is happening at a landscape scale throughout much of the upper Midwest and throughout a lot of the West as well. Certainly in much of corn and soybean country and a lot of other areas as well. And this is true also of roadsides. So a lot of departments of transportation are spraying herbicides to remove weeds in roadsides vegetation. And this is also an indirect effect of removing habitat or food for bees. So certainly there's a lot out there about the effects of herbicides. I'm glad that's a good question. I'm glad someone brought it up.
Yeah. Another one, are insecticides present in seeds?
Yes, they can be. In fact, there are some seeds that are pre-treated with insecticides with a coating. such that when the plant grows, it develops and all the insecticide can be expressed in every tissue, just like we talked about. This is more common in agricultural crops than it is with sort of wildflower seed or seeds that you might find or purchase anywhere. But yes, they can be present in seeds. And certainly if a plant that was treated with a neonicotinoid produces a seed, there's going to be a small dose of neonicotinoid in that seed as well, just because it's expressed in every part of the plant that has water in it. So yeah, it creates a cycle that can increase. That concentration will decrease over time, but it's still there, and the effects of that have not been well measured.
Somebody asked about controlled burns and what the impact is if it's carried out between December and March.
Not a lot's known about spring burns, but generally we recommend that burning's probably a good thing for bumblebees. And that time of year is probably best. Most bees are probably still under the ground and would be protected in their hibernacula. The question is how quick flowering resources would return from that, and would there be flowers available in the early spring with a burn? I would imagine with a light spring burn, that is probably possible, but I'll also fully admit that I am based in the Pacific Northwest, and I do not know the ecosystems that I do not familiarly know the ecosystems in Missouri to speak with authority on those. That might be something that Bill can speak about or talk more about, or maybe Jake as well. I don't know enough about the systems there to talk with authority.
I can answer it to some degree. Burning is usually considered a good thing if it's done, especially during the dormant season. In Missouri, we get so much competition from grasses. The burning during that time can help set them back and encourage any forbs you've got into planting. Most of the bumblebees are going to be underground. If you get your burning done before March 1, you should be in good shape. The other concern on burning for all bees in general is, 20% of our native bees nest in stems. And so you don't want to burn your pollinator plot all at once, maybe in chunks, a third to a half at a time, so you can preserve the nest of those bees that nest in stems.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning that last part there, Bill, in terms of best practices. When we burn or do anything, ideally the goal is to create habitat heterogeneity, and maintaining that heterogeneity is really important. So yeah, whether it's burning or spraying herbicides or some other mowing a large parcel of land, I'm not talking about your yard, but generally we recommend between a third and a half as well, Bill. So yeah, thanks for bringing that up.
There's an interesting question in here asking if there are native plants that people can buy for bumblebees to pollinate that aren't easy for honeybees to pollinate.
Native plants? You could go back to that list of plants that Katie provided that are buzz pollinated. One that would immediately come to mind would be vaccinium. So blueberries and other things like that. Honeybees can pollinate them, but it's more work for them and they don't get as much out of it. But bumblebees will happily do it all day long. So vaccinium would certainly be a good choice. I imagine there are some native vacciniums in the area. Flax lilies could be another one that benefits from buzz pollination. And then, things with longer corolla tubes would certainly benefit some of our longer tongued species as well. So those would be my quick and dirty thoughts. I don't know if you have any. I actually thought about that question, but it's a good and interesting
It's a
one.
good one, yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe indigos too, they have sort of like the bumblebee's weight is it's easier to pollinate that flower, but honeybees might still pollinate that one.
A lot of the natives that you see honeybees on are the monarda or bee balm and the asters. Things like pitcher or blue sage. Again, it's got that deep flower. I've only seen bumblebees on that. Some of the sunflowers in the fall, typically only see native bees on those. But if you're trying to discourage honeybees, monarda isn't good for honeybees, but it is good for honeybees, but it's also good for bumblebees.
Yeah, it also occurs to me that I believe that lupins, native lupins, largely don't produce nectar. They only produce pollen. And so bumblebees will happily go collect pollen from it. But I don't think I've really ever seen many honeybees on it. This is just sort of trying to remember in my brain here whether that's true or not. But I think it may be true. That would be another one I'd recommend.
Looks like there's another question in here. How are our cooler temperatures affecting bumblebee populations over the long haul, even though their bodies can tolerate it?
Sorry, Katie, I was trying to catch up on the chat here and I missed your question. I'm sorry.
Okay, it sounds like it's asking about the effects of climate change. It's saying, how are cooler temperatures going to affect bumblebee populations over the long haul, even though their bodies can tolerate it?
Cooler temperatures. My guess is that they would be pretty well adapted to a scenario like that. It's really a question of how the plant populations would respond to that more so than the bumblebees. Obviously it's going to have effect on physiology and a lot of other things, but I think my bigger concern would be the plant population than it would be about the bumblebees, who I think could probably adapt to that. Although maybe have lower fecundity. It could be like an added stressor to the stressors we've already talked about.
Yeah, I'm going to get my second screen up here. We've got about 20 minutes left.
Okay.
All right, how's that? Can you see it?
Looks good to me.
Okay. Well, I'll present this section and then we should have a little bit of time at the end. We can cover some of those questions or they can be answered in the chat through text. So now we're just going to sort of go over just a brief introduction to the Missouri Bumble Bee Atlas, what the project is and what we hope to accomplish, so that next time when we start going over data sheets and things like how to swing a net or how to photograph a bumblebee, you'll have a better understanding of why you might want to do those things. So now that we have a really nice understanding of bumblebees from the ecology section and the wonderful decline session that Rich just went over, we know that they are general species. So they're out from April all the way to October, November. They're foraging on a wide variety of plants. So they're bees that we are easily able to recognize, right? Most of us can pick up on a bumblebee and there's a lot of opportunity for us to see them. And we also know that they're imperiled. So this is a really nice organism for us to get a lot of people involved in and start looking for them out on the landscape. So the Atlas is based off of community science. So with more people signing up, the idea is to spread out across the state and everyone conducts the same survey, but whatever part of the state they're in, and then we look at that data. And so as people are out conducting surveys, we're going to be able to start looking at population changes. So we're going to get a nice snapshot of what the bumblebee populations look like in Missouri right now. And we can compare that to what we knew of them 20 years ago or 40 years ago and start to pick up on those trends of how they've shifted and make predictions for where they might be going in the future. We can also look at the distribution of species and see if some of them are declining in range or maybe some of them are expanding. And we can also look at habitat associations. There's a lot of unknowns that we don't know, or obviously they're unknowns. There's a lot of things that we don't know about bumblebees. There's a lot with their nesting habitats. We're not quite sure what exactly they're picking up on the landscape or what species they're looking for. We're not very sure what the queens are looking for when they're trying to find that place to overwinter in. And so with more people out assessing habitat, we're going to be able to key in a little bit closer to what bumblebees are looking for. And having all of this information helps us to form evidence-based recommendations. So we have conservation guidelines in place right now, but with a better understanding of the bumblebees' range, their population sizes, what they need in the habitat, this is going to allow us to more efficiently support them. So how the project is set up is we've taken the entire state of Missouri and split it up into 75 different grid cells. And as a volunteer signs up for the project, they adopt a grid cell. So you can adopt any grid cell that you like, and you go through a training, which we're doing right now. And then once you're familiar with the protocols, you go out and you conduct your own surveys, you submit your data, and then all of that data is collected and we analyze it. So here's the current grid adoption map. I think this was yesterday because it's changed a little bit. And all the green cells that you see are still available for adoption. There is no volunteer participating in that part of the state yet. So if you haven't adopted a grid cell, see if you can adopt one of the green ones first. The yellow ones have been adopted by at least one person, but they're still available. And then the gray cells that you see are where 5 people have already adopted it. So we've closed off those cells. So after you've adopted your grid cell, you go through your training. And just a reminder that these webinars are going to be recorded and placed online. So if you forget something or you want to refresh yourself, these are going to be available online for anybody. If you have a friend that wants to get involved, they can go to the online training center and check it out. And that's where we have all of our data sheets. We have a bumblebee identification guide. So everything that you're going to need is on the website. And once you're familiar with the protocols, you're feeling ready and confident, that's when you get to go out and do the fun stuff, like conducting the surveys and photographing the bees. And the nice thing about the Atlas is that it's all catch and release. So there's no bumblebees harmed in this process. And the way that we get around that is by chilling the bees. So you catch your bee, whether it's in a net or directly in a vial, you put it in crushed ice, and this cools the bee down and makes it immobile. It kind of goes into like a short-term hibernation mode. And this allows you to take really clear photographs of the bumblebee that you then submit, and researchers on the back end like Rich or myself or I will be identifying them. And all of this data is submitted through Bumblebee Watch. And Bumblebee Watch launched in 2014 for the United States and Canada. It's sort of like iNaturalist, and it's just gathering observations of bumblebees. So between 2014 and now, there's been almost 80,000 observations of bumblebees from more than 30,000 different people. And this data set feeds into Bumblebees of North America, which is the largest database of bumblebee observations for North America. So everything that we know about bumblebees is sitting in this wonderful data set. And the really cool thing about Bumblebee Watch is that in the last decade, it's provided 25% of the records in bumblebees of North America. So community science is really powerful and really helps us understand a lot more in a short amount of time. There's also a mobile app for Bumblebee Watch. So again, just like iNaturalist, you can snap photos while you're out walking your dog or in your backyard and submit it right from your phone. So now I just want to see, we'll launch another poll here really quickly. How many of you have used Bumblebee Watch? We'll get that one up. Here we go. Looks like a few people have used it, but not too many yet. All right, well, that will be exciting to see some more people get that app downloaded and start submitting bumblebees. And so here's just a snapshot of Nebraska and Missouri from Bumblebee Watch. And you can see that between 2014, when there were no Atlas projects, there were a few observations from people participating. But then in 2019, when we launched the Nebraska Bumblebee Atlas, we added almost 700 observations. And last year, when Missouri launched and we had 2 Atlas projects going, almost 3,000 observations were submitted. And you can really see that through the years, those states start to define themselves as more people are just out looking for bumblebees. So it really helps us to learn a lot. And the great thing is that people are enjoying their time out there. So people that have participated in an Atlas are valuing their experience and are learning a lot and plan to return again. And that is a really powerful piece, right? Education is key in pollinator conservation, because once we have an understanding of the species that we're trying to protect or why pollinators are important, it's a little bit easier for us to go out and take action. And the Bumblebee Atlas is one of those action steps that we can all do. You know, not all of us can go out and create these wonderful habitats, but we can participate in the Atlas. And so the Atlas tries to keep up with all the volunteers. We have the Facebook group, and we also have an Instagram that you can tag us in, or we'll keep posting stuff throughout the season. But it's really, really fun to see all of the different stories that people are sharing as they're going out and conducting surveys, or maybe they found a new species, or they're seeing a new part of the state. It's a really great time to connect with other like-minded people and helping conserve pollinators. So just a reminder that the workshop part 2 is on this Thursday. It's the same time. If you haven't registered for that, you'll need to. It's a separate link, so we can drop that in the chat too. And then I just want to say that as you exit this webinar, there's going to be an evaluation that pops up. And if you could take a few seconds to fill that out, it would really, really help us. Use those to improve and get better. So thank you all for being here tonight, and hopefully we see most of you again on Thursday. And with that, we can take any questions.
I was trying to answer a bunch of questions while you were doing that. There are some questions about grid cells. If the grid cell that the person is interested in got filled in, or someone has adopted it, can they still participate?
Yes, we're not going to turn anyone away. However, sometimes it's good to think about places that you might travel. I know travel right now is a very uncertain thing, but if you have a family member in a different part of the state and maybe you're going to go see them at some point, you can think about adopting that grid cell. Or if it's on the way to somewhere where you go vacation, maybe your friend has a plot, think about different grid cells that you might be able to get into and survey. But we are going to talk about survey areas on Thursday as well, where some good places are to survey in the state. So yes, you can still participate, but really think about all the options and see if you can adopt another grid cell.
Yeah, I would just add that redundancy is good in those situations, right? Just because someone adopted it doesn't mean that they're actually going to conduct a survey there. Hopefully they will, because they're committing to it, but it doesn't necessarily mean it. So when a grid cell has reached a point where we feel like enough people have adopted it that it's very likely going to be surveyed, we will remove it from adoption. You wouldn't be able to adopt it anymore. Again, that doesn't mean that you couldn't conduct a survey there and submit your data. You're still welcome to do that, but certainly don't be scared away if someone has adopted your area. We welcome your participation from everybody. A question about disease transmission during catch and release.
Valid concern. It is a possibility. So as you are going out and conducting surveys, you can wash your vials with a mild soap and warm water and just keep them clean as you're going out to different places to survey. There's a question here about adding counties to the adoption grid. There's a Google map that has the grid cells displayed over it, but you can also just type directly into that map a certain location. So instead of having counties, if you know where you want to go survey or there's a certain town in the county that you're looking for, you can type that right into the map and it should pop up with what grid cell you're in. The evaluation will pop up as soon as you leave the webinar.
I also just put the link in the chat for that.
Okay. Links to where you can purchase net are on the website. We will also talk about that on Thursday. But if you go into the handbook, there's a whole supplies list and it has a couple of links for where you can purchase nets, or you can simply search into Amazon or Google aerial insect net, and you'll usually get quite a few options. Can the grid be found? The grid adoption map is on mobumblebeeatlas.org. If you click on Get Involved, you'll see a page for Adopt a Grid.
I just put the link in the chat to that as well.
Perfect.
See a couple questions about whether people can participate in their backyard or look or take pictures of bumblebees on flowers. We certainly hope that you will. We certainly hope you'll go in your backyard and take pictures and get interested. And then we hope that interested expands to going somewhere nearby and then maybe going on a tour of the whole state and surveying everywhere that you'll get the bumblebee bug. We find that people really enjoy it and begin to take it on as a hobby. So if you're interested, certainly go in your backyard and look, and then hopefully you'll want to maybe go a little bit further and let us know if you have questions and we can help you get started.
Yeah. And a few of these, like when can you expect to see worker bumblebees for most species? Again, we're going to cover that next time of when's the prime time to survey, but it is peak summertime. So July, August is when you're going to see a lot of bumblebee workers out.
There, I also see some questions about plant lists and other things like this. I believe when you registered for this, you should have gotten a link to the resources page. And I can drop the link to that right here in the chat. This has a lot of plant lists, a lot of the conservation information that we talked about. So please feel free to check that out. You can download the packet there, and it'll have the training manual and a lot of other things that you will find useful. So lots of resources in that link that I just put there, train online.
And Karen's asking if it's possible to coordinate with other people in the same cell. And that, again, I would say join the Facebook group. It's a closed group, so it should only be volunteers in there, and you can put out a call to see if other people are in that cell if you're looking to meet up or have certain questions about the area. All right, well, thank you everyone for joining us tonight.